Loneliness is a cruel teacher, and it had been Dorian's only companion for 400 years. Some nights he wondered if immortality was actually a curse disguised as a gift. Dorian is an alpha vampire who lives alone in a crumbling castle. He has incredible power, but has never known love or even friendship. For centuries, his pride and fear kept everyone away. Then one rainy night, Evelyn knocks on his door. She's a 62-year-old widow whose car broke down on the country road. She needs shelter from the storm. Evelyn is warm, funny, and completely unafraid of her own imperfections. Her laughter brings life to rooms that have been silent for decades. As hours turn into days, her kindness begins to melt his frozen heart. For the first time in centuries, Dorian feels truly alive. Can love really find us at any age? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The ancient castle stood like a forgotten monument against the rolling hills of the English countryside, its stone walls weathered by centuries of rain and wind. Dorian Blackthorne had called this place home since 1624, when he was still foolish enough to believe that immortality meant freedom. Now, as thunder rolled across the October sky, he understood the truth. Forever was simply another word for alone. The massive iron gates at the castle's entrance had rusted shut decades ago. Dorian preferred it that way. The world beyond those gates had changed too many times, too quickly. He had watched empires rise and fall, seen plague and war sweep across continents like waves. People he might have called friends, if he had allowed himself such luxuries, had aged and died while he remained unchanged. After the first century, he stopped trying to connect. After the second, he stopped leaving the castle grounds entirely. His transformation into a vampire had been accidental, the result of a desperate attempt to save his dying village from a plague that had already claimed his family. An ancient creature, dying itself, had offered him a choice: watch everyone perish or accept a gift that would make him powerful enough to protect what remained. Dorian had chosen power, not knowing the price would be eternal solitude. The creature had warned him about the hunger, about the need for blood, about the way sunlight would burn his skin. But it had never mentioned the deeper curse, that his very nature would make genuine intimacy impossible. As an alpha vampire, he possessed strength that could crush stone, speed that made him nearly invisible to human eyes, and a presence that commanded respect and fear in equal measure. But these gifts came with an overwhelming intensity that frightened mortals. Every emotion he felt was magnified, every desire amplified beyond normal human experience. In his early decades as a vampire, he had tried to form connections. But his touch was too cold, his passion too fierce, his very presence too otherworldly. Women who might have loved the man he once was recoiled from the creature he had become. Men who could have been friends sensed something predatory beneath his charm. Children, with their innocent perceptions, simply knew to stay away. So Dorian had made a choice that seemed like wisdom at the time. He would remain untouched, unloved, but at least he would not hurt anyone. He would not risk losing control of his strength during moments of passion. He would not watch lovers age and die while he remained frozen in time. He would simply exist, alone but safe. The castle reflected his isolation. Once grand halls now stood empty, their silk wallpaper peeling and their crystal chandeliers dim. The library, with its thousands of books, had become his primary companion. He had read every volume multiple times, memorizing poetry in a dozen languages, studying philosophy that promised answers but delivered only more questions. The drawing room still held a piano that he played during the long nights, filling the silence with melancholy melodies that no one would ever hear. His bedroom, though he rarely slept in the traditional sense, contained a massive four-poster bed that had never known the warmth of shared affection. The windows were sealed with heavy drapes that blocked out the dangerous daylight. During the day, he rested in a hidden chamber beneath the castle, a place so removed from the world above that he sometimes forgot there was a world at all. miles away. Evelyn Morrison was discovering that grief had its own geography. 6 months after burying her husband of 37 years, she was still learning to navigate a world designed for couples. Tonight, she was driving back from her daughter's house in London, where she had spent a weekend pretending to be fine while her children fussed over her with the kind of careful attention usually reserved for broken things. Evelyn had always been what people politely called sturdy. At 62, she carried herself with the confidence of a woman who had birthed 4 children, buried both her parents, and run a household that somehow always had room for one more guest at dinner. Her grey hair was cut in a practical bob that required minimal fussing, and her clothes favoured comfort over fashion. She had learned long ago that happiness came from accepting what you could not change and improving what you could. But tonight, as rain began to streak her windshield, she felt the familiar weight of loneliness settling over her like a heavy coat. Her children meant well, but their concern felt more like pity with each passing month. They spoke to her in careful tones, as if grief might be contagious. They offered to move her closer to them, to find her activities suitable for a woman her age, to help her adjust to life as a widow. What they could not understand was that she did not want to adjust. She wanted to live. Harold's death had taught her something unexpected, that time was more precious than she had ever imagined, and that waiting for life to begin again was simply another form of dying. She wore her wedding ring still, a simple gold band that had grown loose on her finger over the years. Sometimes she caught herself turning it when she was nervous, a habit that had developed during their courtship and never faded. Harold had been a good man, steady, kind, devoted to his family. But their love, while real, had been built on compatibility rather than passion. They had grown into each other like 2 trees planted too close together, their branches intertwining more from necessity than design. Now, driving through the countryside with the radio playing softly, Evelyn found herself wondering about the roads not taken. Had she been too careful, too practical? Had she missed something by choosing security over adventure? The car began to make an ominous rattling sound just as the rain intensified. Evelyn pulled over to the side of the narrow country road, her headlights cutting through the darkness to reveal nothing but rolling hills and distant trees. She tried restarting the engine, but it responded with only a weak wheeze before falling silent entirely. She sat for a moment, rain drumming against the roof, and felt a laugh bubbling up from somewhere deep in her chest. Of course, this would happen tonight when she was already feeling sorry for herself. Harold would have known exactly what to do. He had always been good with mechanical things. But Harold was gone, and she was here, alone in the dark with a dead car and no cell phone signal. Through her rain-streaked windshield, she could see a faint light in the distance. It appeared to be coming from what looked like a large house or manor, set back from the road and partially hidden by trees. Evelyn grabbed her umbrella and purse, locked the car, though she could not imagine who might want to steal it in its current condition, and began walking toward the light. The road leading to the house was gravel, overgrown with weeds that suggested few visitors ever made this journey. As she got closer, the building revealed itself to be a castle, genuine medieval stone and all. It seemed to rise from the hillside like something from a fairy tale. Though this particular fairy tale appeared to need a good caretaker, Evelyn paused at the massive front door, suddenly aware of how she must look, a middle-aged woman in a damp coat, holding a floral umbrella, about to knock on a stranger's door in the middle of the night. It was the sort of thing Harold would have called impractical, and her children would call dangerous. But it was also exactly the kind of small adventure she had been craving without knowing it. She lifted the heavy brass knocker and let it fall against the wood with a sound that seemed to echo through the night. Then she waited, rain dripping from her umbrella for whatever came next. The sound of the knocker echoed through the castle like a gunshot. Dorian froze in the library, a leather-bound volume of Keats falling from his hands to the floor. In 4 centuries, no one had knocked on his door. Tradespeople left deliveries at the gate. The occasional lost hiker wandered past without stopping. The sound came again, more insistent this time, and Dorian felt something he had not experienced in decades, curiosity mixed with dread. He moved through the castle with inhuman speed, pausing at the heavy wooden door. Through the ancient glass, he could see a figure, small, feminine, holding an umbrella against the storm. A woman alone at his door in the middle of the night. Every instinct told him to remain silent, to wait until she left. But the knocking came a third time, and something in its rhythm suggested determination rather than desperation. Dorian opened the door. The woman on his doorstep was not what he had expected. She was older, perhaps in her 60s, with silver hair dampened by rain and kind eyes that showed no fear despite the intimidating circumstances. She wore a practical coat and sensible shoes, and when she smiled at him, it was with the confidence of someone accustomed to solving problems. "I'm terribly sorry to bother you so late," she said, her voice warm with a slight northern accent. "My car has broken down just up the road, and I was wondering if I might use your telephone to call for help." Dorian stared at her, momentarily speechless. He had imagined this moment countless times over the centuries, the arrival of an unexpected visitor, but in his imaginings, the encounter had always ended with his supernatural nature being discovered and the visitor fleeing in terror. This woman seemed more concerned about dripping on his doorstep than about the fact that she was addressing a pale stranger in a castle at midnight. Yes, of course," he managed, stepping aside to let her enter. "Please come in from the rain." Evelyn stepped into the foyer, immediately struck by the grandeur of the space despite its obvious age. The ceiling soared above them, supported by stone arches that spoke of medieval craftsmanship. A chandelier hung overhead, its crystals catching the light from wall sconces that flickered like candles. The air smelled of old wood and something she could not identify, something ancient and slightly metallic. "What a magnificent home," she said, genuinely impressed. "Have you lived here long?" "Quite some time," Dorian replied carefully. He watched her examine the space with appreciation rather than fear, noting how her presence seemed to fill the empty hall with warmth. "The telephone is in the drawing room. Please, this way." As they walked through the castle, Evelyn found herself fascinated by the contradictions around her. The building was clearly ancient, yet it was immaculately maintained. Portraits lined the walls, all of them seeming to depict the same pale, dark-haired man through different periods of history. The furniture was expensive but worn, as if it had been loved for generations. "I'm Evelyn Morrison," she said as they entered the drawing room. "I feel awful imposing on you like this." "Dorian Blackthorne," he replied, gesturing toward an antique telephone on a side table. "And it's no imposition at all. I so rarely have visitors." Evelyn noticed the way he said it, not with bitterness, but with a kind of resigned acceptance that tugged at her heart. She had raised 4 children and been married for nearly 4 decades. She knew loneliness when she saw it. The telephone, when she tried it, produced no dial tone. "The storm may have affected the lines," Dorian said, though he knew the truth was simpler. He had disconnected the service years ago, having no use for contact with the outside world. "You're welcome to wait here until morning. Perhaps the weather will clear, and your car situation will seem less dire in daylight." Evelyn considered this. She should feel nervous about staying in a stranger's house overnight, but something about Dorian's formal courtesy put her at ease. He reminded her of the heroes in the classic novels she had loved as a girl, brooding and mysterious, but fundamentally gentle. "That's very kind of you," she said. "I suppose I don't have much choice. Though I should warn you, I'm not the most exciting house guest. I tend to ask too many questions and make tea at inappropriate hours." For the first time in centuries, Dorian smiled, a real smile, not the practiced expression he had worn during his few interactions with delivery people or officials. "I can't remember the last time anyone made tea in this house." They settled into chairs by the fireplace, which Dorian quickly brought to life with a gesture that seemed effortless, but struck Evelyn as oddly practiced. The flames cast dancing shadows across his pale features, and she found herself studying his face. He was handsome, in an old-fashioned way, with sharp cheekbones and dark hair that looked like it belonged in a Renaissance painting. But there was something timeless about him, as if he had stepped out of history itself. "Do you live here alone?" she asked, then immediately felt presumptuous. "I'm sorry, that's none of my business." "Yes," Dorian said simply. "I have for quite some time." "It must get lonely," Evelyn said gently. "It's such a large place for one person." The observation hit Dorian like a physical blow. No one had ever acknowledged his loneliness so directly, so kindly. Most people sensed something dangerous about him and kept their distance. But this woman, Evelyn, seemed to see past whatever it was that frightened others. "Loneliness is a choice," he said, the words coming out more harshly than he intended. "I prefer solitude." Evelyn raised an eyebrow. "Do you?" "Because I've been lonely for 6 months now, since my husband died, and I can tell you with absolute certainty that there's a difference between choosing to be alone and being lonely. One is peaceful, the other is just sad." Her directness surprised him. In his experience, people danced around difficult topics, especially with strangers. But Evelyn spoke about loss and loneliness as if they were weather conditions. Unpleasant but manageable. "I'm sorry for your loss," he said, and meant it. "Thank you. Harold was a good man. We had 37 years together, which is more than many people get." She paused, studying Dorian's face in the firelight. "What about you? Have you ever been married?" The question hung in the air between them. Dorian had never been asked such a thing so directly. How could he explain that he had never even been touched with genuine affection, that his very nature made such intimacy impossible? "No," he said finally. "I've never found the right person. Or maybe you've never let yourself look," Evelyn said gently. The accuracy of her observation sent a shock through him. In one evening, this stranger had seen through centuries of carefully constructed solitude to the truth underneath, that his isolation was not preference, but protection. Outside, the storm continued to rage, but inside the castle something was shifting. For the first time in 400 years, Dorian was having a real conversation with another person. And for the first time in 6 months, Evelyn felt truly seen by someone who was not trying to fix her grief or manage her future. Neither of them slept much that night, though they talked until dawn. Morning brought both relief and complication. The storm had passed, leaving the countryside washed clean and gleaming under weak sunlight. Evelyn woke on the drawing-room sofa, where she had fallen asleep near dawn, covered by a wool blanket that smelled faintly of lavender and age. Dorian was nowhere to be seen. She found him in the kitchen, standing with his back to her, as he stared out a window that faced away from the morning light. He wore the same clothes from the night before, and his dark hair was perfectly arranged, despite the early hour. Something about his stillness struck her as odd. He stood like a statue, without the small movements and fidgets that usually marked human presence. "Good morning," she said, and he turned with a smile that seemed forced. "Good morning. I trust you slept well?" "Better than I have in months, actually." She gestured toward the window. "Beautiful day. Shall we see about my car?" They walked together down the gravel drive, Dorian staying carefully in the shadows, cast by the overhanging trees. The car, when they reached it, looked even worse in daylight than it had the night before. Steam rose from under the hood, and something dark had leaked onto the road beneath it. "I'm afraid it looks rather terminal," Evelyn said cheerfully. "Harold always said I had a gift for killing automobiles." Dorian examined the engine with surprising expertise. "The cooling system has failed completely. This will require significant repair work, days, perhaps weeks, depending on the availability of parts for a car this age." "Weeks?" Evelyn blinked. "Well, that's inconvenient. I could arrange for you to be driven to London," Dorian offered, though something in his voice suggested reluctance. "Or to the nearest town with a proper hotel." Evelyn studied his face. "Is that what you'd prefer?" The question caught him off guard. What he preferred? No one had asked him that in so long that he had almost forgotten preference was something he was allowed to have. No, he admitted. "Last night was the first interesting conversation I've had in years. But I wouldn't want to impose on your plans." "My plans," Evelyn said with a laugh. "It consisted of driving home to an empty house where I would spend the rest of the week reading books I've already read and pretending to enjoy cooking for one person. I think I can spare a few days for good conversation." Something loosened in Dorian's chest, a tension he had carried for so long that he had forgotten it was there. "Then you'll stay?" "If you'll have me. Though I should warn you, I'm going to want to earn my keep. This place could use a woman's touch." The next 3 days fell into a rhythm that surprised them both. Evelyn proved to be exactly what she had promised, a woman who could not sit idle. She arrived each morning in the kitchen with her knitting needles and a small basket of supplies she had apparently produced from her luggage, creating order wherever she went. She cooked meals that filled the castle with scents Dorian had not experienced in centuries. Roasting meat, fresh bread, herbs from the overgrown garden that she somehow coaxed back to productivity. She hummed while she worked, old songs that seemed to make the ancient stones themselves more welcoming. Dorian found himself drawn to wherever she was, fascinated by her easy competence. She mended tears in centuries-old tapestries with the same calm attention she gave to darning socks. She organized his library by some system known only to her, chattering about books as she worked. "You have wonderful taste in literature," she said, running her fingers along the spines of leather-bound volumes. "Though I notice a distinct lack of romance novels." "I've never seen the appeal," Dorian said carefully. "Of course you haven't. You're a man, and probably one who thinks love should be serious and tragic and full of noble suffering." She pulled a slim volume from the shelf, a collection of love poems he had read countless times. "But sometimes love is just two people making each other laugh over breakfast." The observation stung because it highlighted everything he had never experienced. He had read about love in 1,000 books, had memorized poetry that captured its essence, but he had never lived the simple reality of it. "Perhaps," he said. "I wouldn't know." Evelyn glanced at him sharply. "How old are you, Dorian?" The question sent ice through his veins. "Older than I look." "That's not an answer. It's the only answer I can give." She studied his face for a long moment, then returned to her organizing. "We all have our secrets, I suppose." But as the days passed, Evelyn began to notice things that didn't quite add up. Dorian never seemed to eat, though he prepared elaborate meals for her. He was never around during the brightest parts of the day, claiming to prefer working in his study during daylight hours. His skin was always cool to the touch, even when standing near the fire. Most telling were the small anachronisms in his speech and knowledge. He spoke about historical events with the certainty of someone who had lived through them. He knew details about the castle's construction that seemed far too intimate for someone who had simply inherited the property. And there were moments when his formal courtesy slipped into something much older, more archaic. "You're not who you pretend to be," she said on the third evening as they sat by the fire. Dorian tensed. "What do you mean?" "I mean you're hiding something important." She set down her knitting and looked at him directly. "The question is whether it's something that would hurt me to know." For a moment, Dorian considered telling her everything. The words hung in his throat, desperate to be spoken. But how could he explain what he was without destroying the fragile connection they had built? "I would never hurt you," he said instead. "That's not what I asked. It's the only promise I can make." Evelyn nodded slowly. "Then I suppose that will have to be enough." "For now." But that night, as she lay in the guest room Dorian had prepared for her, a beautiful chamber with windows that faced east toward the morning sun, she found herself wondering exactly what kind of man lived alone in a castle, never aged, and seemed to know far more about the world than should be possible. And in his hidden chamber beneath the castle, Dorian lay in the darkness and wondered how long he could maintain the deception, and what would happen when the truth finally came to light. By the end of the first week, something fundamental had shifted in the castle's atmosphere. Rooms that had stood silent for decades now echoed, with Evelyn's humming and the soft click of her knitting needles. She had discovered Dorian's hidden library, a smaller, more intimate space behind the main library, where he kept his most treasured books, among them She found something that made her pause, a collection of letters, written in Dorian's careful handwriting but never sent. They were love letters, dozens of them, addressed to women with names like My Dearest Heart and Beloved Unknown. The words were beautiful, passionate, and heartbreakingly lonely. "You write beautifully," she said that evening. Setting the letters on the table between them, Dorian's face went white. "You shouldn't have read those. You're right. I'm sorry, but they were so lovely and so sad." She reached across the space between their chairs and touched his hand. Who were they for? His skin was always cool, she had noticed, but now it felt like marble. "No one. Everyone. I don't know. 400 years of longing," she said quietly, and he jerked his hand away. "What did you say?" "Nothing. A feeling I had." But Evelyn's eyes were thoughtful as she studied his face. "You know, my grandmother used to tell stories about the old families in these parts. Families that seemed to go on forever, generation after generation, looking exactly the same. Folklore," Dorian said quickly. "People love their ghost stories, do they?" Evelyn picked up her knitting again, her needles moving in a steady rhythm. "Harold never believed in anything he couldn't see or touch. Very practical man, my husband. But I've always thought the world was more mysterious than we like to admit." They fell into silence, but it was charged with unspoken questions. Dorian found himself watching the gentle movement of her hands as she worked, creating something beautiful from simple wool. There was something hypnotic about her competence, her ability to bring order and warmth to everything she touched. "Tell me about your marriage," he said suddenly. Evelyn's needles paused. "What would you like to know?" "Everything. What it was like to share a life with someone." She considered this. It was like learning a dance, I suppose. At first, you step on each other's toes, but eventually you find your rhythm. Harold and I were good partners. We raised 4 children, built a comfortable life, supported each other through difficult times. Were you happy? Most of the time, yes. But she stopped, as if she had been about to say something she shouldn't. But what? But I sometimes wondered what it would be like to be truly seen by someone. Harold loved me, but he loved his idea of me. The wife, the mother, the woman who had dinner ready at 6 and remembered everyone's birthdays. I don't think he ever wondered what I dreamed about when I couldn't sleep, or what made me laugh when no one was watching. Dorian felt something twist in his chest. "And what do you dream about?" "Adventure," she said without hesitation. "I dream about being brave enough to say what I really think, to do things that surprise people. I dream about being wanted for who I am, not just for what I can do for others." "You are brave," Dorian said. "You're here, aren't you? Staying in a stranger's house, asking difficult questions. This doesn't feel like staying with a stranger," Evelyn admitted. "It feels like coming home." The honesty in her voice made something crack open inside Dorian's chest. For the first time in centuries, he found himself truly looking at another person, not just observing them, but seeing them. Evelyn was beautiful, but not in the way the world typically measured beauty. Her face was lined with experience, her body soft with the years of living fully. But her eyes held a warmth that made him feel as if he were standing in sunlight. "Evelyn," he said, and her name felt like a prayer. "Yes? I haven't been honest with you." She set down her knitting. "I know. About who I am, what I am. I know you're not an ordinary man," she said gently. "I've known that since the first night. The question is whether you trust me enough to tell me the truth." Dorian stood abruptly, moving to the window where moonlight streamed through the glass. "What if the truth changes everything between us?"
What if it doesn't?
He turned to look at her. This remarkable woman who sat in his chair as if she belonged there, who had filled his empty castle with life and laughter. "What if I told you I was older than you could imagine? That I've lived in this castle for 4 centuries, watching the world change while I remained the same? Then I would say that explains why you seem to carry the weight of so much loneliness," Evelyn said calmly. "And I would ask if you've spent all that time waiting for someone to love you for what you are, rather than despite it." The simplicity of her acceptance nearly brought him to his knees. "You don't understand. I understand that you're afraid," she said, rising from her chair to stand before him. I understand that you've been alone for longer than anyone should have to bear. And I understand that whatever you are, you've been gentle with me from the moment we met." She reached up and touched his face, her warm fingers tracing the sharp line of his cheekbone. "I also understand that I'm falling in love with you, and that terrifies me more than any secret you might be keeping." For the first time in 400 years, Dorian allowed himself to be touched without fear, without reservation. Her hand against his skin felt like absolution. "I'm falling in love with you too," he whispered. "And I have no idea what that means or how it's possible." "Then we'll figure it out together," Evelyn said. "One day at a time." Their evenings began to center around the garden. Behind the castle lay acres of overgrown wilderness that had once been formal grounds, complete with walking paths, a rose garden, and a stone bench positioned to catch the moonlight. Evelyn had discovered it on her third day and immediately declared it a tragedy that such beauty was being allowed to fade. "Gardens need tending," she said, pulling weeds with determined efficiency. "They need someone to care about them." Dorian watched her work, fascinated by her assumption that everything could be improved with sufficient attention. She approached his neglected grounds the same way she had approached his lonely castle, as a problem with a solution, rather than a permanent state of decay. "It's been centuries since anyone sat on that bench," he said, nodding toward the weathered stone seat at the garden's heart. "Then it's past time someone did." Evelyn straightened, brushing dirt from her hands. Tonight, they had fallen into the habit of walking together after dark, when the air was cool and Dorian seemed most at ease. He never explained why he preferred the night, but Evelyn had noticed how he moved differently in darkness, more gracefully, more confidently, as if he belonged to the shadows. That night, they sat together on the ancient bench while moonlight painted the garden silver. The stone was cold beneath them, worn smooth by centuries of weather, but Evelyn's presence made it feel like the most comfortable seat in the world. "Tell me about your children," Dorian said. He found himself hungry for stories of the life she had lived, the connections she had built. 4 of them, scattered across the globe now. Evelyn's voice carried both pride and wistfulness. "James is a doctor in Scotland, very serious like his father. Sarah lives in Australia with her family. 3 children I see twice a year if I'm lucky. Michael is in London, too busy with his career to call much. And Emma," her voice softened, "Emma is in America, married to a wonderful man who makes her laugh. You miss them." "I miss who they used to be," she admitted. "I miss bedtime stories and scraped knees and the way they would run to me when they were frightened. Now they're all adults with their own problems, and I'm just the woman who sends birthday cards and worries too much." Dorian heard the loneliness beneath her words, recognizing it as an echo of his own. "They're fortunate to have you, are they? Sometimes I wonder if I was a good mother or just a persistent one. I kept them fed and clean and safe, but did I teach them to be brave? Did I show them how to love without fear?" "You're showing me," Dorian said quietly. The honesty in his voice made her turn to study his face in the moonlight. "Am I? Every day. The way you approach everything, my secrets, my strangeness, this crumbling castle, as if love is just a choice you make rather than something that happens to you." "Love is a choice," Evelyn said. "The feeling might be involuntary, but what you do with it, that's always a choice." They sat in comfortable silence for a while, listening to the night sounds around them. An owl called from somewhere in the trees. The wind moved through the overgrown roses, carrying their scent on the night air. "Evelyn," Dorian said eventually, "what if I told you that loving me might cost you more than you expect?" "What do you mean?" He struggled to find words that wouldn't frighten her away. "What if being with me meant leaving your old life behind? What if it meant your children might not understand?" "My children already don't understand me," she said with a rueful laugh. "They think I should take up watercolors and join a book club for widows. They want me to shrink down to a size that fits their idea of what a woman my age should be. And what do you want?" "I want to feel alive," she said simply. "I want to matter to someone in a way that has nothing to do with what I can do for them." I want to love and be loved for who I am, not who I used to be or who I might become. Dorian felt his control slipping. The way she spoke about wanting to be truly seen, truly known, it matched his own desperate hunger so perfectly that it was almost painful. "You matter to me," he said, his voice rougher than he intended. "More than you could possibly know." "Then show me," she said, turning to face him fully. The moonlight caught in her grey hair, making it look silver. Her eyes were steady on his, without fear or hesitation. She was offering herself to him, not just her body, but her trust, her future, her heart. And for the first time in 4 centuries, Dorian wanted to accept. He leaned forward slowly, giving her time to change her mind, to remember that he was strange and dangerous and not quite human. But she didn't pull away. When his lips touched hers, she sighed as if she had been waiting for this moment all her life. The kiss was gentle at first, tentative, as if they were both afraid of breaking something precious. But when Evelyn's hand came up to cup his face, when she pressed closer instead of pulling away, something in Dorian's chest burst open like a dam breaking. He had read about desire in countless books, had written about it in his lonely letters, but he had never experienced the reality of it, the way it made his entire body feel electric, the way it made the world narrow down to just the two of them on a stone bench in a moonlit garden. When they finally broke apart, they were both breathing hard. "Oh," Evelyn said softly, "are you all right?" "More than all right." She smiled at him, her face luminous in the moonlight. "I was beginning to think I'd forgotten how to feel like this." "Like what?" "Young," she said. "Desirable. Like a woman, instead of just someone's mother or widow." Dorian touched her face, marveling at the warmth of her skin. "You are the most beautiful woman I have ever known, even with all these wrinkles. Especially with them. They're proof that you've lived, that you've smiled and laughed and loved. They're proof that you're real." That night they sat on the bench until dawn began to lighten the eastern sky, talking and kissing and planning impossible dreams. And for the first time in either of their lives, the future felt like something worth believing in. The morning after their first kiss brought an unexpected visitor. Evelyn was in the kitchen, humming as she prepared breakfast, when the sound of a car engine broke the morning quiet. Through the window, she watched a small red sedan navigate the overgrown drive, followed by the crunch of footsteps on gravel. Dr. Margaret Henley had been Evelyn's physician for 15 years, and she had driven out to the castle with the kind of determined concern that only old friends could muster. "Evelyn Morrison, what on earth are you doing out here?" Margaret demanded as Evelyn answered the door. "Your daughter Sarah called me in a panic. She said you disappeared somewhere in the countryside and weren't answering your phone." "My phone doesn't work out here," Evelyn said, though she realized she hadn't actually tried it in days. "And I haven't disappeared. I've just been delayed." Margaret pushed past her into the foyer, her medical bag in one hand and her car keys in the other. She was a small, efficient woman with steel-grey hair and the no-nonsense manner that came from 40 years of dealing with people who didn't take proper care of themselves. Delayed by what? And where exactly is here? Margaret's eyes took in the ancient stone walls, the soaring ceiling, the obvious expense and age of everything around them. "Good heavens, Evelyn, what is this place?" "It's a castle," Evelyn said, as if that explained everything. "My car broke down, and the owner was kind enough to let me stay while it's being repaired." "Owner?" Margaret's eyebrows rose. "Where is this mysterious benefactor?" As if summoned by her words, Dorian appeared in the doorway. He moved with his usual silent grace, dressed impeccably despite the early hour. Margaret took one look at him, and her expression shifted from concern to something closer to alarm. "Dr. Henley," Evelyn said quickly, "this is Dorian Blackthorne." "Dorian, this is my dear friend Margaret." Dorian inclined his head with old-fashioned courtesy. "Dr. Henley, a pleasure." Margaret stared at him for a long moment, her medical instincts clearly triggered by something she couldn't quite identify. His skin was too pale, his movements too controlled, his very presence somehow unsettling in a way she couldn't define. "Mr. Blackthorne," she said carefully. "How long has Evelyn been staying with you?" "Nearly 2 weeks now," Dorian replied. "She's been excellent company. 2 weeks." Margaret's voice rose. "Evelyn, your children are worried sick. They've been calling every hospital between here and London. I should have found a way to call," Evelyn admitted, feeling guilty. "But the time has just gotten away from me." Margaret's sharp eyes moved between them, noting the way they stood slightly closer than strangers should. The way Evelyn's face had a glow that had been missing since Harold's death. Professional concern warred with personal affection as she tried to assess the situation. "Perhaps we should speak privately," Margaret said to Evelyn. They moved to the drawing room, leaving Dorian standing alone in the foyer. Through the partially open door, he could hear their conversation with his enhanced hearing. "Evelyn, what's really going on here?" Margaret's voice was gentle but firm. "This isn't like you. You don't just disappear for weeks without contacting your family." "I haven't been disappearing," Evelyn said. "I've been living." "What does that mean?" "It means for the first time in months I wake up looking forward to the day. It means I feel like myself again, not just Harold's widow or someone's mother. It means I'm happy, Margaret. And this happiness has to do with Mr. Blackthorne." There was a pause, and Dorian found himself holding his breath. "Yes," Evelyn said quietly. "I know how it sounds. A woman my age, getting involved with a man I barely know. But Margaret, I've spent 6 months feeling like my life was over. These past 2 weeks, I've remembered what it feels like to be alive. He's much younger than you," Margaret said carefully. "Is he?" Evelyn's voice held a note of amusement. "I'm not so sure about that. Evelyn, I'm concerned about you. This isolation, this sudden attachment to a stranger, these can be signs of depression, of not processing your grief properly, or they can be signs of falling in love." The words hung in the air. Dorian felt something tight in his chest loosen and constrict at the same time. She had said it so simply, so certainly. Love. Margaret's voice was skeptical. "After 2 weeks? When you reach my age, Margaret, you learn to recognize the real thing when you see it. And you learn not to waste time pretending otherwise." After Margaret left, reluctantly with promises extracted that Evelyn would call her children immediately, they sat together in the garden. The afternoon sun forced them to stay in the deeper shadows, something Margaret had noticed with her doctor's eye for detail. "She thinks I've lost my mind," Evelyn said. "Have you?" Dorian asked. "Probably," Evelyn smiled at him. "But I've never felt more clear about anything in my life." That evening, Dorian made his decision. He led Evelyn down to the castle's lower levels, through corridors she had never seen, to a heavy wooden door, marked with symbols that looked far older than the castle itself. "My true resting place," he said, his hand on the door handle. "The place I go during the day when the sunlight would burn my skin." Evelyn looked at the door, then at his face. "You're going to show me, aren't you? What you really are, if you're certain you want to know." "I've been certain since the first night," she said. "The question is whether you're brave enough to trust me with the truth." Dorian opened the door and led her into the darkness, toward a revelation that would change everything between them. The chamber beneath the castle was unlike anything Evelyn had ever seen. The walls were carved directly from living rock, covered in symbols that seemed to shift and dance in the candlelight. At the center of the room sat an ornate coffin, its dark wood inlaid with silver that caught the flickering flames. But it was the goblet on the stone altar that drew her attention, an ancient chalice that seemed to pulse with its own dark energy. Even from across the room, she could sense something powerful and terrible about it. "This is where I sleep," Dorian said, his voice echoing strangely in the stone chamber. "Where I have slept every day for 400 years. Evelyn approached the coffin slowly, running her fingers along its carved surface. The wood was warm to the touch, worn smooth by centuries of use. "It's beautiful," she said quietly. "And lonely. Everything about my existence has been lonely," Dorian said. "Until you—" She turned to face him, noting how the candlelight seemed to make his pale skin glow. "Tell me the rest." "All of it." Dorian moved to stand beside the altar, his hand hovering over the ancient goblet. "I was made into what I am by drinking from this chalice. It was 1624. The plague had come to my village, and everyone I loved was dying. A creature, ancient, powerful, dying itself, offered me a choice. What kind of choice? Power enough to save what remained of my people, or watch them all perish while I remained helpless. His fingers traced the goblet's rim. I chose power. I drank from this cup and became something no longer entirely human. Evelyn listened without interruption as he told her about the transformation, the burning that had remade his body, the hunger that had replaced normal appetite, the strength that could crush stone, and the speed that made him invisible to human eyes. I saved no one, he continued, bitterness creeping into his voice. By the time I understood what I had become, the plague had taken them all anyway, and I was left with immortality and a nature that made true connection impossible. Why impossible? Dorian looked at her directly, his eyes catching the candlelight in a way that made them seem to glow. Because I am a vampire, Evelyn. I survive by drinking blood. I'm stronger than any human, faster than any human. And when I lose control, which happens more easily than you might think, I am dangerous beyond measure. The word hung in the air between them, like a physical thing. Vampire. After 2 weeks of suspecting, of noticing the small impossibilities that surrounded him, hearing it stated so plainly was both shocking and oddly relieving. Have you ever killed anyone? She asked. The directness of the question surprised him. Yes. In the early years, before I learned control, I'd told myself they were criminals, people who wouldn't be missed. But that was just convenient rationalization. I was a monster, and I acted like one. And now? Now I sustain myself on what I can obtain without killing. It's not ideal, but it's possible. He watched her face carefully. Are you horrified? Evelyn considered this. I should be, shouldn't I? A normal person would run screaming. Yes, but I keep thinking about those letters you wrote, about 400 years of loneliness, about the way you've been so careful with me, so gentle. She stepped closer to him. I keep thinking that if you were truly a monster, you would have hurt me by now. I could hurt you without meaning to, Dorian said urgently. My strength, my passion, everything about me is amplified beyond human measure. In moments of intense emotion, I could accidentally— Stop, Evelyn said firmly. Just stop! She moved to stand directly in front of him, close enough that she had to tilt her head back to meet his eyes. Do you love me? More than I thought possible. And I love you, not despite what you are, but including what you are. She reached up to touch his face. Dorian, I've lived 62 years. I've seen real monsters, men who hurt their wives, parents who abandon their children, people who choose cruelty when they could choose kindness. You are not a monster. You're a man who was given an impossible burden and has carried it with grace for centuries. You don't understand the danger. I understand that you've been alone for 400 years because you decided that was safer than risking connection. I understand that you've been so afraid of hurting someone that you've never allowed yourself to love or be loved. Her voice softened. And I understand that you're more afraid of losing me than of anything else. Dorian felt something break open in his chest. Yes. Then trust me to make my own choices. Trust me to know what I can handle. And if something goes wrong, if I lose control and hurt you, then we'll deal with it together. But Dorian— She cupped his face in both hands, forcing him to look at her. The only way you're going to hurt me is if you push me away because you think you know what's best for me. For a long moment, they stood there in the candlelit chamber, surrounded by the symbols of his supernatural nature, while the weight of centuries seemed to settle around them. I've never been touched by someone who knew what I was, Dorian whispered. Then let me be the first. She kissed him then, there in the heart of his darkness, and for the first time in 400 years, Dorian allowed himself to believe that love might be possible. When her lips met his, he felt no surge of dangerous hunger, no loss of control. Instead, he felt something he had never experienced before. Peace. I love you, he said against her mouth. All of you. Your laugh, your stubbornness, your ridiculous optimism about everything. I love the way you hum while you cook, and the way you organize my books by some system only you understand. I love that you see broken things and immediately start thinking about how to fix them, even when the broken thing is a 400-year-old vampire. Especially then. They made love that night in his chamber, surrounded by the ancient symbols of his transformation. It was gentle and desperate and perfect. Two people who had given up on finding love, discovering it in the most impossible circumstances. Afterward, as they lay together in the narrow confines of his coffin, which was far more comfortable than it looked, Evelyn traced patterns on his chest with her fingertip. "So what happens now?" she asked. "I don't know," Dorian admitted. "I've never had a now before." "Then we'll figure it out as we go," she said, the same words she had spoken weeks ago. "One day at a time." But even as she spoke, they both knew that the outside world would not disappear simply because they had found each other. Her family, her life, the expectations of a world that would never understand their love, all of it waited beyond the castle walls. For tonight, though, none of that mattered. Tonight they had each other, and that was enough. 3 days after Dorian's revelation, Evelyn's carefully constructed peace was shattered by the sound of multiple car engines in the drive. She looked out the kitchen window to see 2 vehicles approaching, her son Michael's silver BMW and her daughter Sarah's practical estate car. "They've come for me," she said quietly. Dorian appeared beside her with that silent grace she had grown to love. Perhaps Dr. Henley was more concerned than she let on. Or perhaps my children think I've lost my mind. Evelyn smoothed her hair and straightened her shoulders. "Well, I suppose it was inevitable." The confrontation began the moment they walked through the door. Michael entered first, his jaw set in the stubborn line she recognized from his childhood tantrums. Behind him came Sarah, carrying a folder that Evelyn suspected contained medical information. "Legal documents, or both?" "Mum," Michael said without preamble, "we need to talk." "Good morning to you too, darling," Evelyn replied calmly. "Would you like some tea?" "We're not here for tea." Sarah's voice carried the strained patience of someone who had been rehearsing this conversation during the entire drive from London. "We're here because you've been missing for 3 weeks, and when we finally track you down, we find you living in a castle with a complete stranger." "His name is Dorian Blackthorne," Evelyn said, "and he's not a stranger." "Not anymore." Michael's eyes found Dorian, who stood quietly in the doorway. The contrast between them was stark. Michael in his expensive suit, radiating urban efficiency, and Dorian in his timeless elegance that seemed to belong to another century entirely. "Mr. Blackthorne," Michael said with forced politeness. "I'm Michael Morrison, Evelyn's son. Perhaps you could give us some privacy to discuss family matters. This is his home," Evelyn said before Dorian could respond. "If anyone should leave, it should be uninvited guests who arrive making demands." Sarah stepped forward, her expression softer but no less determined than her brother's. "Mum, we're worried about you. Dr. Henley said you seem different. Disconnected from reality." "I seem happy," Evelyn corrected. "Apparently that's so unusual that it requires medical intervention." "You disappeared for 3 weeks," Michael said, his voice rising. "You missed Emma's birthday call. You didn't return anyone's messages. James flew in from Scotland thinking you might be dead." Guilt twisted in Evelyn's stomach. She had been so caught up in her new life that she had forgotten the people who had worried about her for months. "I should have called. I know that. But I needed time to figure some things out." "What things?" Sarah demanded. "Mum, you're 62 years old. Dad's been gone for 6 months. This isn't the time to be making major life decisions. When exactly would be the time?" Evelyn asked. "When I'm 70, 80. When I'm safely tucked away in a care home where I can't embarrass anyone." "That's not what we want," Sarah said, "isn't it? Because it sounds like you want me to go back to being the grieving widow who calls on Sundays and sends birthday cards and never does anything unexpected." Michael pulled out his phone, scrolling through what appeared to be a long list of missed calls. "Mum, look at this. 23 missed calls from Sarah alone. 14 from me. 6 from Emma in California. We thought something terrible had happened to you." "Something wonderful happened to me," Evelyn said quietly. "I fell in love." The words fell into the room like stones into still water, creating ripples of shock and discomfort. Sarah and Michael exchanged the kind of look that adult children share when they think their parent has lost their mind. "Mum," Sarah said carefully, "it's normal to feel confused after losing a spouse. Sometimes people reach out for connections that aren't real." Evelyn's voice sharpened. "Is that what you were going to say? That my feelings aren't real?" "I was going to say healthy," Sarah replied. "Mum, you've known this man for 3 weeks. Dad died 6 months ago. Don't you think it's possible that you're looking for something to fill the emptiness, and this," she gestured vaguely toward Dorian, "seems like an easy solution?" Dorian had remained silent throughout the exchange, but now he stepped forward. "Perhaps I should explain, I don't think that's necessary," Michael interrupted. "Mum, we've made arrangements. There's a lovely assisted living community in London, very close to Sarah's house. You'd have your own flat, but there would be people around, activities, medical care if you need it. Assisted living." Evelyn stared at her son in disbelief. "Michael, I'm 62, not 92. I don't need assistance with anything. You need assistance with making rational decisions," he replied. "This whole situation proves that." The conversation continued for another hour, growing more heated as positions hardened. Sarah produced medical articles about grief counseling and the dangers of rebound relationships. Michael presented financial documents showing how much money Evelyn had in her accounts and suggested she was being taken advantage of. Through it all, Dorian remained largely silent, speaking only when directly addressed. But Evelyn could see the tension in the line of his shoulders, the careful control he maintained over his supernatural strength. She knew her children's accusations were hurting him, even if he would never show it. "Enough," she said finally, standing up with the authority of a woman who had raised 4 children and buried 1 husband. "I appreciate your concern, truly, but I am not a child and I am not incompetent. I am a grown woman who has fallen in love with a good man, and I will not apologize for that or pretend it's a symptom of mental illness." "Mum," Sarah began. "No. You've had your say. Now you'll have mine." Evelyn's voice carried the steel that had gotten her through 37 years of marriage and 6 months of widowhood. "I have lived my entire adult life, making choices based on what other people needed from me. I was the wife Harold needed, the mother you all needed, the daughter my parents needed, and I was happy to be those things most of the time." She paused, looking at each of her children in turn. "But Harold is gone, and you're all grown with families of your own. For the first time in my life, I get to choose what I want instead of what everyone else needs. And what I want is to be here with Dorian for whatever time we have together. And what about us?" Michael asked. "What about your family?" "You'll always be my family," Evelyn said gently. "But you don't get to choose how I live my life." "Not anymore." The silence that followed was heavy with unspoken emotions. Sarah looked as if she might cry. Michael looked as if he might explode. And Dorian looked as if he were watching something precious slip away from him. "If you stay here," Sarah said finally, "if you choose this over your family, things will change between us." "They already have," Evelyn replied sadly. "The moment you decided I was too old and too foolish to know my own heart," after her children left, Michael slamming the door. Sarah pausing at the threshold, as if she might say something more. Evelyn and Dorian stood alone in the sudden quiet. "They'll try to have me declared incompetent," Evelyn said matter-of-factly. "Michael has that look he gets when he's planning something legal and unpleasant." "We could leave," Dorian suggested quietly. "Travel somewhere they couldn't find us. Running away won't solve anything." Evelyn took his hands in hers, noting how cold his skin felt despite the warmth of the room. "Besides, I'm too old to start a life of international intrigue. Then what do we do?" "We fight," she said simply. "We prove that love doesn't come with an expiration date, and that happiness doesn't require anyone else's approval." But even as she spoke the brave words, Evelyn could feel the weight of the choice she was being forced to make. Between the family she had spent decades building and the love she had waited a lifetime to find. The crisis came 2 days later, when a court officer arrived at the castle with legal documents. Michael had moved faster than Evelyn had expected. filing for a competency hearing that would determine whether she was mentally fit to make her own decisions. They're claiming I'm suffering from acute grief-induced psychosis, Evelyn said, reading the papers with grim amusement. Apparently falling in love after 60 is a clinical condition. Dorian paced the length of the drawing room like a caged predator. There has to be something we can do. Some way to fight this? There is, Evelyn said quietly. I can go back to London, agree to the counselling, let them tuck me away in their assisted living facility and pretend this never happened. You can't be serious. I'm completely serious. It would solve everything. My children would be happy, the legal proceedings would stop, and you could go back to your peaceful solitude. Dorian stopped pacing and stared at her. Is that what you think I want? I think you want what's best for me. And maybe what's best for me is accepting that some dreams come too late in life. No. The word came out harder than he intended, carrying centuries of supernatural authority. I won't let you sacrifice yourself for their comfort. It's not your choice to make, Evelyn said gently. Isn't it? Don't I get any say in this? Before she could answer, another car pulled into the drive. This time, it was all 4 of her children, Michael and Sarah returning with James from Scotland and Emma, who had apparently flown in from America overnight. They entered the castle like a delegation, formal and united in their concern. Emma, the youngest at 35, took the lead this time. Mum, she said, her voice gentle but firm, we need to talk about this rationally. I thought we'd already done that, Evelyn replied. No, we accused, and you defended. That's not the same thing. Emma sat down across from her mother, her expression earnest. We love you. We want you to be happy. But this situation, living in isolation with a man you barely know, cutting yourself off from your family, it's not healthy. What would be healthy? Evelyn asked. Living in a sterile apartment, attending craft classes with other widows, waiting politely for grandchildren to visit, living somewhere safe with people who care about you, building a life that makes sense, James said. He was the most like Harold in temperament, steady, practical, deeply uncomfortable with emotional displays. This makes sense to me, Evelyn said. Mum, Sarah leaned forward. We've talked to Dr. Henley. She says there are medications that can help with the confusion, the impulsive decision-making. I'm not confused, and I'm not impulsive. I'm in love after 3 weeks. Michael's skepticism was evident. Mum, that's not love. That's enough. Dorian's voice cut through the room like a blade. He had been standing silent in the corner, but now he stepped forward with the fluid grace that marked his supernatural nature. You want to know what kind of man I am? What your mother means to me? Something in his tone made them all freeze. Emma's hand went instinctively to her phone, as if she might need to call for help. For 400 years, Dorian continued, his voice carrying an authority that seemed to fill the room. I have walked through this world alone. I've watched civilizations rise and fall, seen plagues and wars, and the endless cycle of human suffering and joy. I have stood apart from all of it because I believed that connection was impossible for someone like me. The air in the room seemed to thicken. Sarah made a small sound of confusion, as if she couldn't quite process what she was hearing. Your mother changed that. Not because she was desperate or confused or suffering from grief-induced psychosis, but because she has the rarest gift imaginable, the ability to see past fear to truth. She looked at me and saw not a monster or a threat, but a man who had forgotten how to hope. What are you talking about? James demanded, but his voice lacked its usual confidence. Dorian's eyes began to gleam in the afternoon light, and when he smiled, they could all see the sharp points of fangs that had no place in a human mouth. I am talking about love that transcends the boundaries of mortality, he said softly. I am talking about a woman brave enough to love a vampire. The silence that followed was absolute. Emma's phone slipped from her fingers and clattered to the floor. Michael made a sound like all the air had been forced from his lungs. Sarah simply stared, her medical training warring with the evidence of her own eyes. That's impossible, James said finally. Is it? Dorian moved across the room faster than human eyes could follow, appearing beside the fireplace as if he had simply materialized there. Is it more impossible than a 62-year-old woman finding perfect love with a stranger? Is it more impossible than happiness arriving just when you've given up hope for it? You're insane, Michael whispered. You're both insane. We're in love, Evelyn said simply, standing to move beside Dorian. And for the first time in my life, I know exactly who I am and what I want. She looked at each of her children in turn, these people she had raised and loved and sacrificed for, who now stared at her as if she had become a stranger. I choose him, she said quietly. I choose love over safety, adventure over comfort, truth over convenience. And if that means losing all of you, then I suppose that's the price of finally living authentically. The weight of her words settled over the room like a physical thing, and for the first time since this began, her children seemed to truly understand that their mother was not confused or sick or manipulated. She was simply done living her life according to their expectations. The aftermath of Dorian's revelation played out in stunned silence. Emma had retrieved her phone from the floor, but seemed to have forgotten what she meant to do with it. James sat heavily in a chair, as if his legs had stopped working properly. Sarah's medical training kicked in first, though her voice shook when she spoke. This isn't possible, she said. Vampires aren't real. This is some kind of elaborate delusion. Touch my hand, Dorian said simply, extending his arm toward her. Sarah recoiled instinctively. No, my skin is cold as marble, even near the fire. My heart beats perhaps once every few minutes. I cast no reflection in mirrors, and direct sunlight would burn me to ash within moments. His voice was patient, almost gentle. Your mother discovered these things gradually. She chose to love me anyway. Michael found his voice, though it came out as barely more than a whisper. You're telling us our mother is in love with a vampire. I'm telling you that your mother is the first person in 4 centuries to see past what I am to who I am, Dorian replied. She is the bravest, most remarkable woman I have ever known. She's our mother, Emma said fiercely, as if that trumped everything else. Yes, Evelyn said quietly, and I will always be your mother. But I am also a woman who has spent most of her life putting everyone else's needs before her own happiness. I'm done with that, Mum. James stood up, his practical mind trying to process the impossible. Even if we accept, even if this is real, you're talking about giving up everything. Your life, your family, your humanity. Am I? Evelyn looked at Dorian, seeing not the supernatural creature that frightened her children, but the man who had brought laughter back into her life. Or am I talking about finally choosing to live authentically? What does that even mean? Sarah demanded. Living with a vampire? What kind of life is that? A life where I matter, Evelyn said simply. Where someone sees me as more than just a caretaker or a responsibility, where I'm valued for who I am, not what I can do for others. The brutal honesty of her words hit her children like physical blows. They had come here expecting to rescue their mother from a poor decision. Instead, they were confronting the possibility that their love for her had been conditional on her remaining safely predictable. We value you, Michael said, but his voice lacked conviction. Do you? When was the last time any of you asked me what I wanted instead of telling me what I needed? When did you last consider that I might have dreams and desires that had nothing to do with being your mother or Harold's widow? The questions hung in the air, unanswered because the answers would have been too painful to voice. Dorian moved to stand behind Evelyn, his hands resting gently on her shoulders. The gesture was protective, but not possessive. Supportive rather than controlling. Your mother has given me something I never thought possible, he said. A reason to exist beyond mere survival. In return, I offer her eternity. Not just length of years, but depth of experience. We can travel to places she's only read about, see wonders that most humans never imagine. And the cost? Emma asked. What does she have to give up? Nothing that matters, Evelyn said before Dorian could answer. I'll still be me, still be your mother. I'll just be more. More what? Sarah's voice cracked, more alive than I've been in decades. The conversation that followed was painful and necessary. Her children tried every argument they could think of. Practical concerns about legal documents and inheritance. Emotional appeals about grandchildren she might never meet. Medical warnings about the psychological dangers of such a dramatic life change. But underneath all their words was a deeper fear, that their mother was choosing a life that had no room for them in it. "Will we see you again?" Emma asked finally, tears streaming down her face. "If you want to," Evelyn said gently. "But only if you can accept what I've chosen. I won't live my life apologizing for finding happiness. And if we can't accept it?" The question came from Michael, but they all waited for her answer. "Then I suppose we'll have to love each other from a distance," Evelyn said, her own voice thick with unshed tears. "And hope that someday you'll understand that this isn't about rejecting you. It's about finally choosing myself." One by one, her children left. Emma hugged her fiercely, whispering promises to try to understand. James shook Dorian's hand with obvious reluctance, but some measure of respect. Sarah left medical information about grief counseling. Michael said nothing at all. When the castle was quiet again, Evelyn and Dorian stood together in the drawing room where it had all begun. "Are you certain?" he asked one last time. "I've never been more certain of anything in my life," she replied. "Though I reserve the right to complain if eternity turns out to be boring." Despite everything, Dorian laughed. "I think I can promise you that boredom will not be a problem." That night, they began planning their future together, a future that would span centuries and continents, built on a love that had survived the revelation of impossible truths. 6 months later, the castle had been transformed. Where once shadows had gathered in empty corners, now warmth and life filled every room. The garden bloomed with flowers Evelyn had planted, roses and lavender, herbs and vegetables that flourished under her patient care. She had kept her promise to make the ancient place feel like a home. The transformation in Dorian was equally remarkable. The haunted loneliness that had marked him for centuries had been replaced by something softer, not quite mortality, but a kind of peace that came from being truly known and accepted. He smiled more often now, laughed at Evelyn's stories, and had even begun writing again. Not lonely letters to imaginary lovers, but poems about the reality of love found late in life. "The solicitor called today," Evelyn said over their evening tea. She had adapted to Dorian's nocturnal schedule with surprising ease, finding that she enjoyed the quiet hours when the rest of the world slept. "The life extension procedure worked perfectly. According to my medical records, I'm now expected to live another 200 years. Minimum." It had been Dorian's gift to her, not full vampirism, which would have changed her fundamental nature, but something subtler. A sharing of his immortal essence that would extend her lifespan dramatically while leaving her essentially human. She would age, but slowly. She would remain mortal, but for centuries rather than decades. "Any regrets?" he asked, though his tone suggested he wasn't truly worried about her answer. "Only that we didn't meet sooner," she replied, the same answer she gave every time he asked. "Though I suppose you needed 400 years to become the man I fell in love with, and you needed 62 years to become brave enough to love a vampire." They had established new routines. In the months since her children's departure, mornings were spent in the garden, where Evelyn worked, while Dorian rested in the cool shadows of the overhanging trees. Afternoons were for reading and correspondence. She had written letters to each of her children, patient explanations of her choice that remained unanswered but not unheard. Evenings belonged to conversation and exploration of the castle's many hidden rooms and forgotten treasures. Nights were for love and planning impossible adventures. "Emma called yesterday," Evelyn said, trying to keep her voice casual. Dorian looked up from his book. "And?" "She's thinking of visiting next month. She wants to, how did she put it, assess the situation personally. Are you ready for that?" "I think so. She's the youngest, the most adaptable. If any of them can accept this, it will be Emma." Evelyn smiled. Besides, she's always been fascinated by fairy tales. Dating a vampire might appeal to her romantic sensibilities. They had heard from the others too, in small ways. A birthday card from Sarah with a note asking if Evelyn was happy. A brief email from James with updates about his children. Even Michael had sent a terse message confirming that the competency proceedings had been dropped. Not acceptance exactly, but not complete rejection either. It was a beginning. Dr. Henley wants to interview you, Evelyn continued, for a medical journal article about non-traditional post-grief relationship structures in mature adults. I think that's academic speak for my patient fell in love with a vampire and somehow ended up happier than she's ever been. Will you do it? Anonymously, perhaps, if it helps other people understand that love doesn't come with an expiration date. The conversation was interrupted by a soft knock at the door. Their first visitors since the family confrontation. Evelyn answered it to find a young woman, perhaps 25, with anxious eyes and a backpack that suggested she had been traveling for some time. "Excuse me," the woman said, "but my car broke down on the road and I was wondering if I might use your phone." Evelyn and Dorian exchanged a look filled with shared memory and amusement. "Of course," Evelyn said, stepping aside to let the stranger enter. "Come in from the cold. I'll put the kettle on." As the young woman followed her into the warmth of the castle, Evelyn caught Dorian's eye and saw her own thoughts reflected there. Perhaps this was how love perpetuated itself, not through grand gestures or dramatic revelations, but through simple kindness offered to strangers in need. Later, after the woman's car had been towed and arrangements made for her to stay the night in the village, Evelyn and Dorian returned to their evening routine. But something had shifted, a recognition that their love story was not an ending but a beginning. "We should travel soon," Dorian said as they walked through the moonlit garden. "I want to show you Venice in the winter when the tourists are gone and the city belongs to the shadows. I want to dance with you in Vienna, where the music echoes off stones that have heard 1,000 love songs. I want to see them all," Evelyn agreed. "Every place you've been alone. I want to fill them with new memories." They stopped at the stone bench where they had shared their first kiss, now surrounded by the flowers Evelyn had planted. The garden was no longer a monument to neglect, but a testament to what could grow when tended with care. "Do you think we'll be happy?" Evelyn asked, though she already knew the answer. "I think we'll be many things," Dorian replied, pulling her into his arms. "Happy, certainly, but also adventurous and curious and occasionally impossible. I think we'll spend the next 2 centuries discovering what it means to love someone completely. And if we get bored, then we'll find new ways to surprise each other." As they kissed under the stars, surrounded by the evidence of their shared life, both of them knew that the real adventure was just beginning. Love had found them when they had given up hope for it, proving that the heart's capacity for renewal has no limits, not age, not loss, not even death itself. In the castle that had once echoed with loneliness, laughter filled the halls. And somewhere in the village below, a young woman with car trouble was about to discover that sometimes the most important journeys begin with an unexpected detour.